Everyone, it's so exciting to be with you, and a real thanks to Ari for organizing this incredible month of learning that we have in store from you from the Hadar faculty. Some of you have, as Ari's poll demonstrates, some of you have learned with us before, but for most of you, this is the first time to get to learn with us. And I would say what awaits for you, what's in store for you, is a thrilling month of learning the texts of our tradition. And the text demands interpretation. That's our title, because we felt like one of the things that Hadar does really powerfully is to open up the texts of our tradition and make them relevant and meaningful for all of us living out our lives. So it's a real honor to be with you here today, and looking forward to diving in together. So let's, what do you think, Ari? Can we dive in? Am I ready to go into the actual text? Are we good? Oh, you're muted.
I was just uploading the handout for today, so everyone can have a copy of it. So it should be in.
All right, great. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along that way, if that's what you prefer, or you can click on the link in the chat. The question that we're going to be looking at today is what to do when I don't know what to do. And this is a question that I feel like, as human beings, we all encounter certain situations where we're expected to know something, we're expected to understand how to, be in a decision-making capacity, but we might not know the answer. We might not know what is the thing that is demanded of us. And when I was interested in that question, I was going through and encountering different stories in Jewish tradition of rabbis who also were stuck not knowing what to do. And what I saw was a variety of different examples of stories in which people make different decisions based on who they are. And we can figure out sort of what of the models in the past from our tradition we want to draw from and learn from when confronted with our own situations of wondering how to answer questions that we don't quite know the answer to. So that's what it's sort of I would say the reason I chose this for the opening session of this month of learning Jewish text is a lot of times people come to Jewish learning and they say, well, that's not for me, either because it seems way out there in the past and it's not really relevant to my life, like the material isn't that interesting or relevant to me, or you know what, I haven't done a lot of Jewish learning of text, and so maybe I'm not qualified to jump in and do some learning in this way. And what I want to say is the texts are relevant to our lives and everyone's qualified to do learning. The main thing you need to bring to be able to do Jewish learning is an open stance of curiosity and questions. And I think that's what we're going to encounter in our rabbinic sages as we look at some of the examples and stories from their lives when they felt like they didn't really know what to do in a certain moment, and how we might learn from their stories. Okay, so we're going to dive in, and my method here is we're going to read the story. I have about 5 or so stories of different rabbis confronted with a moment of ignorance, and I'll invite you to use the chat to put any questions, any wonderings, any reactions that you might have to the story as we go along. And I'll pause in between the stories to invite that and read them more specifically. So you're welcome to chat at any time. I think Ari opened up the chat, so you're welcome to do that at any time. I can't guarantee that I will read it all concurrent with your chatting, but I will take breaks and we'll take a look at it at certain moments. Okay, so I'm going to jump into our first story here. And before I start reading the story, just a note on Talmudic stories: they tend to be very short and not a lot of detail. So if it sounds confusing or sort of short on the details, that's just the style, which is fine. And the scenario that we're going to be looking at is, to start off, is a situation of rabbis sitting down together to eat a meal. And a meal, defined in rabbinic literature, is when you break bread with other people in a group. And what we're going to see is it's a little bit confusing about whether or not this particular scenario counts as a meal. So let's jump in and take a look at our first story. I'm going to share the screen. Again, you can open up the PDF that Ari shared as well. Okay, just give me a thumbs up, Ari, if you can see the shared screen. Great. Okay. So let's take a look at this first story. It's a story of a tragic story where Rav, the name of the teacher of the generation, he was such a good teacher that his name was Rabbi. He actually has a personal name that's referred to a couple places in the Talmud, Abba Arichtav, tall daddy, big daddy, you might say. But his title was Rav, and he was really the leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia in the early 3rd century. So this is a story of what happened when he died. When Rav died, his students went after his casket where he was to be buried. They escorted him to his final resting place. And when they returned, when they came back from the funeral, they said, let us go to the funeral. They're burying their teacher. And now it's time to come and have the meal that you're supposed to traditionally have after you're undergoing a burial. Okay, so it seems like we have the ingredients for a communal meal. They're coming together and they're eating bread, and they're at the bank of this particular river. So now we're going to see where it gets complicated. After they ate, they raised a dilemma. Did we learn that if they reclined, it's considered a joint meal? Meaning, if you have a formal meal, then there is some sort of collective experience of the meal, and therefore you should recite the special blessing after the meal, grace after meals. Or if they sat together, but they didn't actually come together as a group eating a meal, maybe it's not considered a joint meal. So what is the scenario that we have here? Did we come together as a group, and therefore that would occasion the Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals? Or did we all eat individually in our own little pockets, sort of COVID style, along the banks of this river? And that's the question on the table. If we were a group, then it would require us to say a blessing after the meal. And if we weren't a group, then we don't say that group blessing after the meal. Okay, that's the question on the table. And again, for a Talmudic story, there's often a question that might seem a little bit narrow, that is going to open up a bigger, sort of bigger emotional reaction in this particular case. So the question on the table is, did we just have a joint meal or not? It was not within their capability to resolve this dilemma. Lo hava biyadayu. Literally, it was not within their hands. They didn't have a grasp on the answer to this question of whether we just had a joint meal or whether we all ate separately. So now, when you don't know something, what are you going to do? Okay, here's a bunch of rabbis, students of the teacher of the generation, and they can't answer this question. So what's a rabbi supposed to do when they don't know? Well, let's see the strong and surprising reaction to what happens when they don't know the answer to this question. So one of the students, Rav Ada bar Ava, stood up and tore another tear in his cloak. He said, Rav has died, and we don't even know how to bless Birkat Hamazon. We don't even know how to say the blessing after meals, which is to say, one of the most basic ritual skills of the Jewish people. You have meals all the time. How is it that we're not even sure whether or not we're supposed to say this blessing, because we can't figure out, were we a group when we ate or were we individuals? Now, Rav Ada bar Ava tears a second rip in his cloak. What's the first rip that he teared in his cloak? That first rip was what he does when he understands that his teacher has died. It's a sign of mourning, right? So the first rip, the first tear, was what happens when you lose a loved member. And indeed, the Talmud considers losing a teacher like losing a parent. So they're in mourning around the loss of their teacher. And now they're mourning all over again because they understand that we don't even know the answers to the most simple questions that are out there. Okay? Now, how does this resolve? This is the sort of everything's held in suspension and all they can do is mourn and weep the loss of their access to knowledge, the loss of their teacher, until this elder came and resolved it for them. And here's the answer. The elder said, notice anonymous elder, not one of the students of Rav, since they said, let's go and eat in such and such a place, it is considered as if they reclined, and therefore it is a formal meal, and they should bless together. Okay, so that's the end of the story. So again, the plot elements are Rav dies, they go to the funeral, the students go to the funeral, then they eat a meal. They can't figure out whether the meal was a joint meal or an individual meal, which would occasion the blessing or not. Rav Bar says, oh my God, we have no idea how to answer this question. And I'm mourning all over again. And then it's resolved when an elder comes and says, you know what, you did have a joint meal, and therefore you should say the blessing at the end. Okay, so I'm going to invite any reactions or comments or questions. I always love questions. Questions end with a question mark. Sometimes hard for Jews to remember how to do that. So I'm going to invite all the kinds of reactions and questions that we might have here, and make some of my comments on my own. So Sarah's asking, does the fact that they were in mourning contribute to this, i.e. this is not a joyful meal? It doesn't seem technically like the quality of the mourning is impacting the meal, but I will say the fact that they weren't all sitting around a table and instead were sitting seemingly individually along the banks of the river might indicate that there was something about the mourning aspect that made this a more unusual situation than your standard meal. But Rav Bar doesn't say, you know, guys, this is a really hard question. Of course, we don't know the answer. This has never happened before. Normally, when we eat, of course we know, but now this is like a very unusual situation. And he doesn't say that. He just sort of jumps into this mourning posture and saying, we're never going to be able to figure anything out anymore, right? He's in this sort of grief situation. Heidi's saying, is reclining different from sitting together? Yes, reclining, you know this from Pesach also, we have to recline on Pesach. I'm leaning in this chair. You know, when we lean to the left on Pesach, that's a formal meal. It's actually a technical term, which became like very embodied, you know, like we have the pillow and we lean on it, but really Haseba just meant, are you engaged in a formal joint meal or not? Okay, let's see. Is this doing the safest approach to a problem, says Mary. Let's see. Why is reclining the signal of a joint meal? Yeah, again, reclining may be just the term and not necessarily the actual body experience. Okay, Deborah's saying elders have wisdom and common sense to resolve problems. And I love that. And we're going to see in the next story as well that an elder is going to solve the problem, or at least give us some sense of what the answer might be. And this elder is not among the students of Rav, and he sort of comes out, Deus ex machina, into the scene and solves the problem for them. And in that way, he's almost the container, the person who's holding on to tradition, and therefore can be a source of wisdom that the students themselves didn't have access to. Now, I would ask, sort of related to this, why didn't the students know how to resolve this problem? And might that be related to the experience of learning in Rav's Beit Midrash? In other words, Rav was the teacher, and apparently when Rav was alive, everybody felt good about answering questions. But the very day on which Rav dies, the very simplest question, you can see the trauma that Rav Bar is holding. How could I go on? I can't even answer any simple questions now that my teacher is dead. And that itself might indicate that Rav's style of teaching was not a very empowered style, meaning it might have been, we don't know, this is just context clues, it might have been that Rav was sort of holding all the answers, which is great as long as Rav is alive, but once he's passed on, as everybody does, then we're left in sort of bereft and this feeling of disempowerment, and that might be also part of what the elder is coming to solve and say, you know what, there are other sources of wisdom, and Rav isn't the only one out there who's going to be able to solve some of these problems. I love the comments that are coming in by the dozens here, so I appreciate that. I'll take a couple more, and then we're going to shift to our next story so we can keep on time here. Arnold said the students were so reliant on the opinions of their teacher they couldn't resolve the question after his death. I think that's what we're, exactly, thinking about the style of Rav's Beit Midrash. And Susanna's even saying, this is a simple question, even I could figure it out. And a random elder shows up and, maybe there's just sort of an emotional overlay that is playing out here, which is clouding their judgment. By the way, the the details in Talmudic stories are important because since there's so few details, whenever they give you a detail, there's something to pay attention to. So the banks of the Danak River, in some versions of the Talmud story, it doesn't say Danak, but it says Anak, which is a synonym for Hanak, which means choking. That is to say, they were on the banks of the river of choking, which is to say they don't have the ability to sort of push out the words that they need to push out. And maybe that's sort of like any normal person, any random elder walking by could answer the question. But me right now, as a student of Rav and in my grief, I can't quite do that. Okay, we've got a lot of great comments here. I'm going to jump to the next story as we move forward and see another example of what happens, a very different example of what happens when you don't know what to do. This is an even shorter story. I'm going to stop the share for just a moment to give you some background here. So the story is going to take place on the question surrounding how I make Kiddish on Shabbat day. And unless this also seems like a relatively simple thing that rabbis should know how to do. If I ask you to make Kiddish on Shabbat day, you should be able to recite the words of Kiddish. But just to point out, the fact that we make Kiddish on Shabbat day is itself something that is a little bit odd. Because when do you sanctify the Shabbat day? You sanctify it at the beginning of Shabbat, which is Friday night. And so the fact that in the middle of Shabbat, like a good 14 hours into Shabbat, you're starting to make a Kiddush, they're making a sanctification of the day, is a little bit odd. And if you think about it, actually, the Kiddush that we say on Shabbat day, like if you've ever been to synagogue and they end the service, holding a cup of wine or grape juice, the blessing that they say is over the cup of wine, but you actually don't use the word mikadesh to sanctify in that daytime Kiddush. So when someone asks you to make Kiddush on Shabbat day, what might you say? It's not as straightforward as you might think. Okay, that's sort of the background to get started. Let's jump into this very short story and see what happens when one of the rabbis was asked to make Kiddush and he didn't know what to say. I'm going to reshare the screen here. Those following along, we're on page 2. Okay. So Rav Ashi went to the city of Machoza. Now, Machoza is a city in Babylonia, which is one of the largest Jewish communities at the time. And Rav Ashi is one of the greatest scholars of the generation. It is attributed to him that he edited the Talmud. Okay, so this is no slouch. He's not a medium level character in the Talmud. He's really one of the greats. And he goes to the city of Machoza. The people there said to him, Liktash lanmar kiddush rabba. Let the master, meaning you, Rav Ashi, make the great kiddush, kiddush rabba. Make the great kiddush. Now, if you're going to open up a siddur, traditional siddur, and you turn to Kiddush on Shabbat day, not Friday night, but Shabbat day, it's called kiddush rabba, the great Kiddush. And some of the commentators to this Talmudic section explain the reason it's called the Great Kiddish is sort of a euphemism because it's kind of the lesser Kiddish. It's not so great, but in order for the Kiddish not to sort of take offense, we'll call it the Great Kiddish just because it's sort of giving some honor in a place where we don't necessarily have all the honor there. Because after all, we made Kiddish last night. So imagine the scene. You're Rav Ashi. You've been invited, scholar in residence, the CSP of the time, invited Rav Ashi for their February, scholar month, and they say, we want to honor you. So they hand them a cup of wine, and they say, why don't you make the great Kiddush? Now, Rav Ashi has no idea what's going on. So he thought, what is the great Kiddush? My new Kiddush Rabba. I never heard of the great Kiddush. Okay. And now, instead of saying, let me ask my host, hey, could you just tell me, I'm happy to do it. Just remind me, what is the Great Kiddish? How do we do that? He does not choose to ask any questions. Instead, he's going to fake it till I make it kind of approach. All right, so let's see how he does it. He says to himself, since all the blessings start with Borei Pri Agafen, blessed are you, God, who created the fruit of the vine, then I'm going to do that as well. So he said, Borei Pri Agafen, and then he paused. Okay, so this is Rav Ashi's attempt here. He's saying, well, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not going to ask anybody what to do. Well, maybe we'll circle back, and I'd be curious in the chat why you think he doesn't ask a question. He simply just goes for it. And he uses his logic, and he says, you know what? I don't know too much about what Kiddush Rabbah is, but I do know when I'm making a blessing over a cup of wine, I'm going to start off by saying, Borei Pri Hagafen, blessed is God who creates the fruit of the vine. And that's what he says. And then he pauses. Okay, now we get another old man, an elder. Chazye lahu Saba, a Saba. He looks at a Saba. I saw an old man who nodded and drank. Okay, that's the end of the action. And Rav Ashi applies to himself the following verse. A wise man has eyes in his head. Okay, so what did Rav Ashi do here? He takes a guess. He waits to see if the guess is correct. He gets some ratification. I sort of imagine this guy in the back holding the shot glass, and he sort of like, nods his head, winks at Rav Ashi, and takes a stiff, gulp. And then Rav Ashi says, oh, I guessed right. This worked out for me. Okay, that's the story, at least according to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi applies to himself the verse, a wise man has eyes in his head. That is to say, I have been able to figure this out. This worked out well for me. Okay, now, that's the whole story. Now, we as interpreters of the story can take a couple of directions here. You could say, well, this is a great example of fake it till you make it, right? He took a guess. He had the facts that he knew. I know that it starts off, Borei Pri Hagafen, blessed is God who creates the fruit of the vine. I'm going with that. And I was right. And I know I was right because the old man drank. Okay, that's one way to interpret the story. And indeed, perhaps the way the Talmud meant it to be interpreted, which the lesson that you would derive is, unlike the previous story where you're totally hung up and you have no idea how to solve the problem, you're like, you know what? Let's go with our best guess here. That's how we're going to move past our state of ignorance. And indeed, if you're Rav Ashi and you're a scholar in residence and you're visiting Mechosa and it's your big moment, you might not be able to ask a question because it might take away from your authority, right? And that's something that we might need to do in that moment. Okay, I'm just looking at some of your comments because I want to read the story in another way in just a minute. Let's see. Did he travel to Mechosa on Shabbat? I don't think so. I think he was invited there and already there. Sarah says, yeah, look to the elder. And again, my question is, how, if he got it right, how come only the elder was drinking? Like when I say Kiddish, back in the old days when we used to go to synagogue and have Kiddish on Shabbat day, as soon as the person says, the line for Kiddish, everybody tears into the food. There's no polite waiting. So how come it was only one guy who waited and then he sort of took the drink there? But it is the elder, and the elder is sort of giving some signal of, yes, you've gotten this right. You're on the right track. Gild is saying maybe he's concerned that he would be criticized for not knowing. I think that is an actual fear of Rav Ashi, and maybe even if he's like, you know what, I shouldn't be embarrassed, but it's going to take away from my stature, and in some ways, these people need me to be the one who knows, and so that's not exactly an option for him. Now, it's possible that the old man is actually digging him out of a situation where he might not have gotten it totally right. In other words, could you imagine the following read of the story? Rav Ashi says, I'm going to fake it till I make it. I know it all starts Borei Pri Hagafen, and then I'm going to pause, and everybody's waiting and saying, what about the part when you say the rest of the words, right? And he's not saying anything. And then the old man says, you know what, let's let this guy off the hook, right? Let's say, all right, I'm going to just drink and we'll get on with it. And it wasn't that Rav Ashi guessed 100% correctly, but he got it right enough that the old man sort of gave him permission to move on. And in that way, he sort of did it even though it wasn't the best way of doing it. So that's the risk, of course, of faking it till you make it, which is to say you might get it wrong, you might not get it totally right, and in that way there's some downside to just going ahead and doing it as opposed to asking, can you remind me, or do you have the bencher, please? Could I see the words? I'd be happy to read them. That's not something that he says. Now, Melvin's saying Bori Paragafen is all that's required. Most people say verses before night. And just to point out, even to this day, when you go to different communities with different traditions in our current societies, the text for the Kiddush on Shabbat day is very different depending on which geographic community you're a part of. And that sort of stems from this story. This story, all that's required is, blessed are you, God, who created the fruit of the vine. And that's not something that we get in other stories here. Yeah, Arnold saying there appears to be a lack of humility here. I think that's right, unless you're saying, hey, what choice do I have? I'm the leader of the generation, and I have to just jump in and do it. And if it is, okay, there's something that happens where you're supposed to just, know the customs of other communities by saying, hey, I've never been to Mechoza. Can you tell me what your custom is? It's just really interesting that he doesn't avail himself of that out and say, tell me what you do here. Okay, so we have two models. Model one was Rav Ada bar Ava. I can't answer any questions anymore. My teacher's dead. Model number two, Rav Ashi, who says, you know what? I need to give an answer, and I'm going to fake it till I make it. Now, we have one other example in the tradition, I would call it, of Rav Ashi, where we have an authority who thinks they know the answer, but is then shown that they actually don't know as much as they think they do. This is the overconfident rabbi who feels like, actually, I'm not ignorant in this moment, but is shown to be ignorant, and therefore is sort of a cautionary tale. Okay, so this is our third model. And our fourth model coming after this is what I think is the most inspiring of our stories. Okay, so let's get the third model. Of course, you knew this was going to be an option in the different stories of rabbis in the Talmud. There had to be one rabbi who was saying, you know what, I'm good. I know all the answers, and nobody has to worry about my rulings because I've got the knowledge. So here we get the story of Shmuel. Shmuel is a contemporary of Rav. Rav was the teacher who died in the first story. So we're again in the 3rd century here. And Shmuel, the other great of that generation, is talking about the special work with the calendar that determine how long the year should be. That Judaism has a solar lunar calendar. It's both based on the months determined by the cycles of the moon, but also needs to be in sync with the sun. So we don't have Pesach showing up in the fall or whatever if you just follow the moon cycle alone, like the Muslim calendar does. So there's a lot of complicated work that needs to happen to set the calendar. And Shmuel says, I am able to fix the calendar for the entire diaspora, for the entire Gola, for everybody outside of the land of Israel, without any witnesses. The normal way that you fix the calendar is with witnesses. It's with people who testify, I saw the moon, and here's the picture of the moon, and here's the way I saw it shining in the sky. And Shmuel says, no, I can figure it out without any help. I don't need any witnesses. I don't need any testimony. I know how to calculate the calendar. Of course, today, that is how we do it. We calculate it. We don't need witnesses to tell us when there's a new moon, but that's what Shmuel is saying he's able to do. So then we get a contemporary of Shmuel who's going to check and see, does Shmuel really know how to do this outside the normal system of witnesses? Abba, the father of Rabbi Simlai, said to Shmuel, does the master know? Do you know the following complicated scenario? Does the master know the meaning of this statement? As it's taught in a Braita. A Braita is a old Jewish teaching. It's contemporary with the Mishnah, but extra canonical. So 2nd century teaching, it says, dealing with the secret of addition, okay? The sod, the esoteric way in which you set the calendar. The addition is the addition of the new month, okay? Actually, we're living this year in the Jewish calendar. There's an extra month, an extra Adar. So do you know how to set the extra month? Do you know how to differentiate between the molad occurred before midday or the molad occurred after midday? Now, the molad is the very moment in time when the moon is at its smallest. And this is a very technical question. Shmuel, do you know what happens if the moon becomes in its smallest form either before noon or after noon? Do you understand how to make calls when that sort of middling hard case scenario comes up? If you don't understand what he's saying, neither does Shmuel. Shmuel says, he says to him, no, I don't know what this means. I'm sorry. I don't know the answer to that question. And he said to him, so Abba, the father of Rabbi Simlai, says, since the master does not know this, there are probably other matters that the master does not know, right? In other words, I'm giving you a hard case, but it's actually a tell that you think you know so much that you can do this on your own, but you probably don't know enough. And therefore, you must not establish a calendar relying upon calculations that were based on faulty or insufficient knowledge. You know what? You better stick with the witnesses instead of saying that you know how to do it all by yourself. So this is an example of a rabbi who thinks they know how to do it, is unable to do it when faced with a hard question, and therefore shown that actually he overstepped his claim. And that's the way in which we are, staying. This is a cautionary tale, staying away from Shmuel. Don't rewrite the rules. You think you know better. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay. Now so we've had 3 models. I'm moving to our 4th model. Again, model number 1, I'm too overwhelmed with grief, or I'm too unempowered to know how to make decisions on my own. Model number 2, I'm going to fake it till I make it. And I think I got it right, although that might be a little bit in question. Model number 3 is, I think I know exactly how to handle all the problems, and turns out I'm stumped. So when I admit, at least Shmuel said, I admit I don't know the answer to that question. And then he sort of backed away from his original claim that I can do all this by myself, or at least seems to be forced to be backed away around that. And now we get, I think, one of the most inspiring stories of what's going on here, where a rabbi knows not what to do, and how does he deal with that particular situation. Okay, so I'm on the bottom of the same page. Now, this is a story of a rabbi named Rabbi Elazar Chisma. Rabbi Elazar Chisma went to a place. Now, what does Chisma mean? That's actually a play on words that the story is going to unpack. So let's figure out. For right now, I'm leaving it untranslated. Rabbi Elazar Chisma went to a certain place. They said to him, does the rabbi know how to lead the Shema responsibly? Now, it used to be in the olden days, actually, if anyone's doing Daf Yomi, we just came across this today, that there was something called Porsin al Shema. When you would recite the Shema, not the way we do it today in synagogue, where everybody covers their eyes and everybody says it together, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. That's not how they used to do it. Rather, it used to be a call and response. And it's a debate about how the call and response used to work. Maybe I said Shema Yisrael, and you responded, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Like I said, Hear, O Israel, and you responded, the congregation responds, Adonai, our God, Adonai is one. That may be one way. Or maybe I said the whole line, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and you responded, Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchut Olam Ved. May God's kingship be blessed forever and ever. Whatever it was, it's a relatively simple call and response. Okay, that's part of what Rebbe Azar Chisma is supposed to know how to do. Like he shows up in synagogue, they say, "Hey, would you lead us in Shema?" And he says, "I don't know how to do that. Sorry." And then they say to him, "Do you know how to lead the Amidah?" This is the standing prayer. Amidah means to stand. This is the standing prayer that is said in every single Jewish service, okay? You, of course, would encounter the Amidah if you're a rabbi or any sort of, regular Jew. Whoever went to the synagogue ever has encountered the Amidah. And they say to him, "Could you please lead us in the Amidah?" And he says, "No, I don't know how to do that." And then every rabbi's nightmare, the congregants or the people who are gathered say to him, "For nothing do they call you rabbi, right? You call yourself a rabbi? Absolutely not." And what happened? Nitkar Kamu Panav. His face fell, literally turned yellow. Okay, he lost all shade to his face, kind of like my face in this life. Okay, so he turned sickly because he realizes that indeed they're criticizing him for not being a knowledgeable enough person to be called a rabbi. And here he is sort of not able to do any of the basic ritual skills that certainly a rabbi, probably most of the educated Jews at that time, would be able to do. Now, what happens after you have this experience? And this is where I find it to be very inspiring. Okay, you didn't know what to do. You didn't know what to do in a very basic situation. And this wasn't even a situation like Rav Ada Bar Ava, where our teacher just died and you could say I was all discombobulated because of my grief. Instead, it's just a regular day and you don't know how to lead the basic prayers of Judaism. Okay, so what does he do as a result of this? Halach etzel Rabbi Akiva. He goes to his teacher, Rabbi Akiva, and his face was still cholaniot. It was still sick. It was choleh. He was looking really sickly. Okay. Now, what does Rabbi Akiva say to him? He says, first of all, he notices that he's not looking well, and his teacher says to him, "Why is your face so sickly? Like, what's going on? Can you tell me?" And then, to Rabbi Azar's chisma's credit, he tells him what happened. Now, you could imagine, right? Going to the rabbi who trained you, right? And he says, "Oh, what's wrong? What's the problem?" And he says, "Oh, I had this very simple request that people asked me to do, and I couldn't get it done." So he tells him what happened. And then Rabbi Akiva, this is, again, what I find to be inspiring. Rabbi Akiva doesn't say, "You terrible student, you spent years with me. How could you not know how to lead the Shema? How could you not know how to lead the Amida? These are basic prayers." He doesn't say that. Rather, he says to Rabbi Azar Chisma, does Rabbi want to learn? And notice what he does. First of all, he calls him Rabbi. He doesn't take away the title for him, even though the crowd that in that certain place did take away his title. Oh, come on, they call you Rabbi? Please. Rabbi Akiva preserves his title and says, do you want to learn? Does Rabbi want to learn? And wanting to learn is, of course, the only antidote to being ignorant, right? Are you willing to actually develop your knowledge and your skills? If I gave you the opportunity to go again, would you take it? And what does he say? He says, yes. That I feel like is the crux of the whole matter here, right? Do you want to learn? Yes, I do. And of course, Rabbi Akiva, there's many stories about him, who as a learner only began to learn at the age of 40, which in the lifespan times, of the second century, I would say was well past middle age, okay? Rabbi Akiva starts his learning journey. And so he recognizes here's another person who, for whatever reason, either he forgot it or he never learned it. It was a gap in his education. Even though it's the most basic ritual skills, he never learned it. And Rabbi Akiva says, would you like to learn? And he says, yes, I would like to learn. So what happens? So once he learned it, he went back there. Rabbi Elazar Chisma goes back to the scene of the crime. Okay? And he says, the people in the town ask him, so does Rabbi know how to lead the Shema responsibly? And he says, yes, I do. And does Rabbi know how to lead the Amida? You know how to lead the most basic prayer in Judaism? And he says, yes, I do. I know how to do that. And now they said to him, Elazar has become strong, Hasim, and they would call him Rebbe Elazar Chisma. Okay, now the name, in other words, his nickname, Rebbe Elazar Chisma, Rebbe Elazar the Strong, is assigned to him at the end of this experience where he's humiliated in the first round. He admits that he doesn't know how to do it. He goes back, thanks to his teacher, and learns it from the beginning and comes back to the same group. You can imagine how much courage that takes, how much strength that takes to go back there and says, yeah, I do know how to do it. Now, the other meaning of the word chosem, chisma, is to be blocked. Like a machsom is a blockade in modern Hebrew. So Rebbe Elazar Chisma used to be Rebbe Elazar the blocked one, i.e., I can't actually say the words. I don't know how to say the words. But my name, along with my own journey, shifts to become Rebbe Elazar the Strong. In other words, the blockage becomes the source of strength. And my own self-identity and awareness shifts to be someone that I don't know how, I didn't know it before, but now I did. Right. Okay. So looking at some of your comments, right? Blockhead, right? Charlie Brown, the blockhead. That's a good description of probably how you were meant to read that name, that nickname, until he gets it recast at the end. HB is saying, did he really not know how to do it? Now that would be really interesting if he was sort of playing a game and saying, I don't know how to do it, but really I do know how to do it. I'm not sure that would lead him to. I mean, it's an elaborate ruse if he went through it and actually didn't know how to do it. But that would be interesting just to give us the example of what it would be like to go back and learn. And for all the adults on this call who are doing some learning and learning Jewish texts maybe for the first time, this is our inspiration, because it's somebody who, even though maybe he knew it, maybe he didn't know it, but he's willing to go back and do it again. Anita says that Rabbi Elazar Chisma demonstrates anava, humility, which Shmuel didn't. Right? And I think that's also part of his strength. You don't think of strong always as associated with humility or willingness to put your tail between your legs and admit that you don't know something. You think of strong as I know things, I know the answers. But this is a new definition of that kind of strength, and that's something that is, that is interesting. Jenny's saying, well, why wouldn't a rabbi know how to do these basic things? I think that's part of the point. You're shocked that a rabbi doesn't know how to do this, and yet he does actually learn how to do it as well. Okay, let's see. I'm looking through the other. Jody is saying, what blessing if children witness this type of humility and integrity. Right. This is like, if this were the model, instead of assuming that everybody should know. When you walk into a class of Jewish learning, of course you know the Torah. Of course you know all the synagogue skills. And of course you know all the holidays. And I'm just here to elucidate one difficult point. But what if it was something around, hey, none of us really know. And that's okay. Some of them didn't know either, but we're willing to learn. Does Rabbi want to learn? Yes. That's sort of the theme, what I would take away from this. Okay, let's move to our last story here in our last few minutes, and see. This is a fascinating debate again with these basic skills. The basic skills of saying the Shema. Things are done every day. Saying the Shema, basic building block of Jewish prayer. Saying the Amida, the rabbinic standing prayer that's in every Jewish service. Saying the blessing after meals. Here's a debate about the blessing after meals. And it gets to one of the core questions about how flexible is Jewish liturgy. And along the way, we're going to see what happens when I don't know something. Okay, so we have a debate. Most of the Talmud is about debates, and this is a debate between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir. Okay, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir, two of the old rabbis from the 2nd century, are debating how much you need to stick to a standard liturgy when you are reciting a blessing. So Rabbi Yossi has the more strict approach, and he says as follows. It's taught, Rabbi Yossi says, anyone who changes from the prescribed formula instituted by the sages for blessings has not fulfilled his obligation, right? So Rabbi Yossi says there's a set down formula, there's a liturgy, there's a set of words that you need to pronounce. And if you don't say the words exactly as they were instituted by the sages, then you haven't executed your obligation. You haven't actually done what you need to do. That is one opinion. But Rabbi Meir has another opinion. Rabbi Meir says, even if one said, Baruch shebara hachefetz hazeh, mana'ehu zeh yatsa. Okay, so if somebody says, blessed is the one who created this thing, mana'ehu zeh, it's so beautiful, right? You're just riffing. I don't know the proper blessing for iced coffee. The sages said a certain blessing, but I don't know it. So what if I just said, blessed is the one who created this beautiful, fantastic drink? Okay, and that's more or less what Rabbi Meir says. If you do that, you're good. You fulfilled your obligation. May not be ideal, but it counts. Okay, so that's the debate, Rabbi Yossi versus Rabbi Meir. Now we get an example of somebody who's actually trying to put Rabbi Meir into action. So let's take a look at this here, okay? Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha says in the name of Shmuel, the law follows Rabbi Meir. Okay, you have to choose. Is it Rabbi Yossi? You can't change any words. Or Rabbi Meir, you can make things up on the spot if you need to. And we have the teaching from Shmuel, the character we saw earlier about the calendar, who says, we follow Rabbi Meir. And here they get a story in which this gets played out. There was an incident involving Rav that supports this ruling. So Rav, who's later in time than Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, makes a ruling that follows Rabbi Meir, follows the more lenient approach to the liturgy. And here's the story. A certain Persian came to Rav and said, what about me? How about me, a regular guy, not from the center of Jewish life at that time in Babylonia, but rather from a farther off land? I don't know how to make a proper blessing. So when I eat bread, I say, Baruch debara hadein pisa, right? Pisa, which is a cognate for pita. Blessed is the one who created this bread. That's all I say. I don't look up in my siddur. I don't have a siddur. I don't know what the sages say, but I am offering a blessing and I am identifying God as the object of that blessing. Blessed is the one who created this bread. Have I fulfilled my obligation? And Rav said, yes. Okay. So this is an example, again, of somebody who doesn't know. This is not a rabbi, but this is an example of somebody who doesn't know the basic building block of Jewish ritual life, right? You know, you might say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Actually, the Talmud debates the exact wording of what you're supposed to say over bread. The one that wins out is the one that we may know today, who brings forth bread from the land. But this guy doesn't know that blessing. He never heard of it. And he certainly doesn't know all the other blessings. And so he's saying, I'm riffing it here. And so in that way, you know, I want to know, am I satisfying my obligation? And Rav says, yes, you are satisfying your obligation because I'm following Rabbi Meir, the more lenient opinion here, who says, yeah, even if you riff it, even if you're just making it up, as long as you're getting the basic idea, you're doing what needs to be done. Okay, and here we have another example of what happens when I don't know. Sometimes, even if you don't know, as long as you're getting in the ballpark, at least according to some rabbinic approaches, that's going to work. Okay, yeah, and Norman's saying the wonderful Hasidic story of the boy who whistles, or in some versions of the story recites the alphabet, doesn't know the prayers, and walks into synagogue. None of the prayers are getting up to heaven. And the boy starts to either whistle or to sing or to say the alphabet. And that's what pierces the heavens because of the intention that's behind it. Perfection is the enemy of the good, right? Exactly. Okay, so what we've done today is taken a look at 5 different examples, 4 of them involving rabbis, one involving a local Persian guy, sort of regular guy off the street, who don't really know what to do, and the different options that await us when we are confronted with that situation. And we saw a lot of different options that are on the table. We saw I can't figure it out, and I'm going to just hold my head in my hands until an elder shows me what to do. We saw the example of fake it till you make it with Ravashi holding the cup of wine. We saw, opportunities to sort of be a little bit bombastic and say, I know how to set the calendar. Oh, actually, I don't know how to set the calendar. Maybe I should rely on the old system. We saw Rabbi Azar who says, I don't know how to do the basic ritual activities here, but I am willing to learn. And we saw the guy on the street who says, I don't know the perfect liturgy here, but I'm getting the main idea, and maybe that should work as well. So what you have here is some models and some options, and most importantly, some evidence that it's not like the rabbis always knew everything, and they just have to deal with not knowing like the rest of us in some moments. And my hope is this will inspire us to continue in our month of learning, to jump in. I guarantee you there'll be things for the people who have never encountered Jewish texts, and there'll be a lot for those who have encountered Jewish texts. That's part of what Hadar does so nicely, is to try to teach at multiple levels. And it's an honor for me to be able to kick off this series. So Ari's going to give us a commercial for what's coming next, and I'll tell you a little bit about my class on Thursday. So go ahead, Ari.
Thank you. Thank you for a great kickoff to the 1 month. And a few questions I noticed. I watched a lot of participation. I think there's one theme saying maybe we'd have different answers if they went to women as leaders back then. So that's a thing to think about. Another question is, of course, you gave us stories, but not in the context. So it'd be nice to know the context of these stories and read before and after to see why they were brought at a particular time. But I'm not going to do that today. A question about the Saba, is that something that you find commonly in the Talmud, a term, or is that only in these, is it rare? And you gave us two examples.
Yeah, the term Saba or the elder, it's not only these two stories. It's not on every page of the Talmud, but it does happen not infrequently that we encounter an unnamed elder who's informing us of some tradition or some ruling.
And then I just wanted to kind of interview you just for a minute or two as to you are the founder of Hadar, you, Rabbi Ethan Tucker, and Rabbi Shai held. Can you tell us why you founded Hadar and what your goal has been and kind of what's happened?
Sure. So I would say at its core, Hadar is really a vision for Jewish life in which people can be connected to and inspired by the texts and the communities and the traditions of our people. And so we were really motivated to devote our careers, instead of being a banker or a fraud investigator, I decided to become a rabbi and try to bring to light some of the depth and richness of our Jewish tradition. And so that is essentially what we are doing, and creating opportunities for you and many thousands of others to learn with us in the United States and in Israel and in other places around the world. You can go to hadar.org, HADR.org, HADAR rather, .org, and you can jump into a variety of different learning options. But we're going to bring that all to you directly through CSP this month, so you won't have to leave the comfort of your CSP home in order to experience more Hadar learning.
So tell us what you have a specific class you're teaching, and it starts on Thursday, and I think it's a 4-part series, Praying Anew, Unlocking Meaning in the Words of the Siddur. What are we going to learn if we join you? We're going
to jump into one of the most used but least understood texts in Jewish life, which is the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book. And we're going to open up some of the most famous prayers in that text. We're going to look at the Amidah, the standing prayer. We're going to look at the prayer around resurrection, which is very controversial, the mourner's Kaddish. We're going to have an opportunity to really dive in to understand all these prayers in a new light. And it'll be a great way to reinvigorate your prayer life, whether you are a regular Jewish prayer or whether you have not really encountered Jewish prayer directly before.
Terrific. So hopefully, I wanted to thank you all for joining us for this opening session. Tomorrow we're back at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. East Coast. And it's the Torah of music, which is a totally different way of learning text. We'll have Joey Weisenberg with us. And I assume he'll have some instruments with him maybe as we learn with him for 1 hour. I wanted to again thank Deborah and Ed Heyman for all they mean to CSP and to our local Jewish community. I want to thank Rabbi Kaunfer and Hadar for really doing amazing things with Jewish learning. I hope you will all join us for more programs. We'll keep track of how many programs you're attending. The maximum, I believe, is 18. And as usual, each year we may have some surprise gifts for those who attend the most programs. Of course, the biggest gift is the learning that you'll get by attending all the programs. So with that, I wanted to wish you all a happy Tuesday. And yes, it's still January. So enjoy the snow if you're in DC or in the East Coast. And if you're anywhere else, enjoy that you don't have snow. Okay, that's all I have to say today. So take care, everybody. Good to see you. Have a good one. Good to see you. Good to see all of you patrons, and Martin and Tamar Brower. It's nice to have you with us. I see Chris Texier and the Gallons. I see Ingrid Gallen. Rita Rubin, nice to have you with us. Phyllis Gilmore. Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you. Rob Fesher. Okay, everybody. I'm off to have some lunch. See you tomorrow.